It's June 1st, 2015, and this is the first in what I hope to be more frequent video recordings regarding interesting conversations or emails that I've engaged in or with, and cool things that I've read recently. This will be more frequent than the longer videos that I will be recording monthly for the newsletter. A relatively common response to my new work has to do with the anger people feel when they open up the Hebrew Bible or even think about the Hebrew Bible as a way to understand their psychedelic experiences in particular and their spiritual lives in a more general sense. The other day I received an email from someone who is visually impaired, not blind, who wanted to describe his DMT experiences to me. Those were interesting in and of themselves, in that the visions were rather blurry and hard to distinguish. At the same time, this fellow wrote some things about the Bible as a legitimate text that I thought were interesting that I will present here. One issue he raised was the cryptic sort of language that he saw, which he described as similar to hieroglyphics. And I suggested that this isn't an unusual thing, both in the DMT state and also occurs occasionally in the prophetic one. The finger writing on the wall of the palace of the king of Babylonia is a good example of that. The king himself was unable to interpret what the glyphs meant and had to call upon the prophet Daniel in order to interpret them. Also, this fellow described a lot of anxiety with the DMT experience, which is common, but for him it was one of the most striking elements. And I again referred to Daniel as a good example of someone whose prophetic states were often marked by a lot of anxiety. Sometimes he would faint or fall down, tremble, shake, those kinds of things. The person writing me complained or rued the fact that he was unable to understand the glyphs that he saw in his vision, and I suggested that with practice he might be able to decipher them. Then he launched into a bit more of a polemic, saying that the God of the Hebrew Bible is a fan of cryptic messages and a sadistic egomaniac. So perhaps the message that this fellow saw might take a lifetime to understand or never to understand. He went on to say that in his opinion, the God of the Bible loves to test his creation and gives them impossible challenges so he can watch us fail. So, based on my understanding of the text, I suggested that God never gives somebody a challenge that a person cannot meet. And a good example of that is Job. The book of Job begins with the Satan, in quotes, not Satan, but the Satan, making a wager with God that Job's piety would crumble under adverse circumstances. Job was wealthy, healthy, had a big family, and was very pious, and the Satan wondered if these were all taken away from Job, if he would still love and serve God to the extent that he was when his situation was good. And Job struggles, and his friends are not of much help, but he does hold on to his faith, and at the end is rewarded with a prophetic experience, essentially. Secondarily, he regains his material possessions, but he never regains his children, who are lost early on in the book. This also gave me a good segue to raise the issue of reward and punishment, which, as I've mentioned before, is simply an anthropomorphic way to explain cause and effect. Certain causes lead to certain effects, and if those effects were performed by a human, they would be called a certain thing. But if they're occurring within the context of nature, for example, they're called something else. But because the moral and natural worlds are regulated by the same creator and sustainer of them, they manifest in a comparable way, reflecting the will and power of the creator and sustainer of both those sets of laws. I also raise the issue that perhaps the Satan, who is sometimes called the evil impulse within each of us, may have actually just been Job's unconscious, and he wondered himself whether or not his piety was simply due to his good fortune. Then this fellow talks about poor old Moses, who leads the Hebrews out of Egypt, and then he's tired and thirsty and strikes a rock to get water for the hungry or for the thirsty nation rather than speaking to it as God had commanded him. And this is ostensibly the reason why Moses is not permitted entrance into Canaan. So I respond by saying that the Talmud equates losing one's temper with idolatry, one of the few cardinal sins and capital crimes in the Hebrew Bible. This could be seen as worshiping one's emotions instead of God. And it's apparent throughout history and even current events that the greatest and the highest people get the hardest tests and are judged the harshest as well. That's something we've all seen. And Moses was the greatest prophet in Jewish history. Moses did lose his temper several times in the Hebrew Bible. And just before striking the rock, rather than speaking to it, he upbraided the Hebrews for being rebellious and difficult. Then this fellow suggests that God rubs salt in the wounds of Moses by having Moses go up to a hillside to overlook Canaan before he dies. So I suggested that one other interpretation is that this was a gift given to Moses that he received in the context of knowing that his flock, as it were, would be entering into such a rich, fertile, and promising land. It's also interesting that immediately after this, Moses asks God to appoint Joshua as Moses' descendant or his replacement, and prays to God that Joshua be led by the same prophetic inspiration that determined Moses' leadership for all of those years. Oops. Why don't we go back to, well, you can figure it out. Pause. So let's start here. It's interesting also to note that immediately after Moses is shown the promised land, he asks God to inspire Joshua, his lieutenant, and who will be taking charge of the Hebrews after Moses dies, to be as inspired as Moses was himself during all of those years of leading the nation. So he did not begrudge anyone anything. So it's hard to see it as necessarily rubbing salt in the wounds as much as giving a compensatory or a consolation prize, as it were. Everybody dies, and most people die without accomplishing what they wish to accomplish. So this really isn't different than what we encounter in our lives all the time. At the end of his email, this fellow Rude also wondering if he had been found wanting in the scales, and that's why his DMT experience wasn't as positive as he had hoped. So, offering some encouragement, I suggested that he study the text if he, number one, hates the text, and number two, wants to get some more out of his experiences than has been the case. And that by doing so, he might be more aware of what he's encountering, better able to manage what he sees, and even ask for help in deciphering that foreign language. Another interesting email was from an 8th grader who had taken on the assignment of what is DMT for his science project in middle school. And he asked me a series of pretty good questions for somebody 13 years old about my DMT research and what I found and what I thought about it. I get a fair number of emails from kids, and I think this is probably one of the youngest people that I've heard from, particularly encouraging. A lot of people want to do research with psychedelics, and I encourage them to get as much academic training as they possibly can. Another interesting email came from a woman who had smoked DMT previously and then for unrelated reasons was getting an MRI of her spine and her head. And she described DMT-like experiences while she was in the scanner. We studied 3 people at UNM in an MRI, but we gave DMT. So they obviously had DMT-like experiences in the scanner. But it's interesting to think about the strong electromagnetic fields which an MR scanner generates. We don't know if strong electromagnetic fields affect DMT synthesis in the body, but we do know that DMT is found in the living rodent pineal gland, and we know that electromagnetic fields affect melatonin synthesis in the pineal gland. So it may be possible that strong electromagnetic fields, possibly through the pineal, may result in elevated endogenous levels of DMT. This is one of the myriad endogenous DMT studies that needs to be done. Finally, I'm continuing to root through the literature about the Hebrew biblical patriarch Abraham. I like Abraham because he was the first person to publicly proclaim the name of God, the God who created Adam, whom Adam knew, and who Noah knew and related to, but whose presence and name had been forgotten for several generations. Abraham discovered God and started teaching about the creator and sustainer of the universe, and lived a fully prophetic life without necessarily following the laws of Judaism, which only came later with Moses. There's a Greek Jewish writer from the 1st century AD whose name is Philo, sometimes called Philo Judaeus, or Philo the Jew, who writes that Abraham followed the natural law. He observed nature and followed the laws of nature. And it was only later, when Moses wrote down the law, that he, in essence, codified the way that Abraham related to both the spiritual world and the natural world. So this again is consistent with the notion that God created and sustains the laws of the natural and the moral world. And by learning and observing nature, one can approach the mind of God, and by doing so, learn the proper moral and ethical ways of relating to the outside world, or the non-spiritual world, which includes both us and everything around us. Okay, so that's it for June 1st. Hopefully I'll be able to put something like this out every 1 to 2 weeks subsequently. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.